What happens when an innocent act turns into a life-altering event? 9-year-old Ava Johnson was just selling lemonade in front of her house, a simple summer afternoon activity. But when Karen Whitmore, a 42-year-old white woman, saw her, she made a decision that would change everything. She called the police, claiming Ava was operating without a permit. Karen thought she was simply keeping the neighborhood in order. She never expected this to land her in a courtroom, facing the kind of justice she never believed could apply to her. And the biggest shock of all, Ava's mother was not just any parent. She was the director of the FBI. Now, Karen finds herself in the very system she thought would always be on her side. But justice works in mysterious ways. The sun was blazing in the sky as Ava Johnson carefully poured lemonade into a cup, smiling as an elderly neighbor handed her a dollar bill. She loved summer, loved the way people stopped to chat, the way she felt like part of the community. But then Karen Whitmore appeared. Karen, a woman who prided herself on keeping the neighborhood respectable, scowled at the small lemonade stand. She had never seen this little girl before, and in Karen's world, something unfamiliar was something that needed to be removed. She marched over, arms crossed. "Do you have a permit for this?" Ava blinked. "A what?" "A permit," Karen repeated, voice sharper now. "You can't just sell things on the street without approval. That's illegal." Ava hesitated. "But it's just lemonade." Karen pulled out her phone. "Then I guess the police will explain it to you." She dialed 911, her voice dripping with fake concern. "Yes, I need officers immediately. There's an unlicensed vendor in front of my house." "Yes, the black girl. No adult supervision. It looks suspicious." She snapped her phone shut and smirked. 5 minutes later, 2 officers arrived. Ava's heart pounded as the taller officer, a man with cold eyes, frowned down at her. "Are you selling drinks, little lady?" "Yes, sir," Ava said, suddenly nervous. The officer exhaled. "I'm gonna need you to shut this down." "But I didn't do anything wrong." "Kid, we don't make the rules. Just pack it up." Tears welled in Ava's eyes. The neighbors murmured in concern, but Karen stood proudly, arms crossed, watching like she had won something. But Ava wasn't alone. Her mother had just been notified. And the moment that call went through, everything changed. Ava stood frozen as the officers loomed over her lemonade stand. The weight of their stares made her feel small, like she had done something truly wrong. The taller officer sighed. "Come on, kid. Let's go. We need to take you in for questioning." Gasps erupted from the crowd of neighbors watching nearby. "She's a child," someone called out. "This is ridiculous," another shouted. But Karen Whitmore just smirked. She had seen things like this happen before, authority figures listening to her, enforcing her version of order. She expected Ava to cry. She expected the neighbors to eventually give up. She did not expect what happened next. Ava took a shaky breath and said, "You should call my mom first." The shorter officer scoffed. "Yeah? And why is that?" Ava's voice was calm but firm. "Because she works for the FBI." The officers exchanged a quick glance, but Karen laughed out loud. "Oh, please," she sneered. "Your mom works for the FBI? That's the best lie you could come up with." Ava pulled out her phone, her small fingers dialing quickly. The line rang once before a voice answered. A cold, commanding voice. "Agent Johnson speaking." Ava exhaled in relief. "Mom? The police are here. They're trying to take me away." Silence. Then, sharp, clipped words. "Put them on the phone. Now." Ava handed the phone to the officer. The man took it, clearly unimpressed. "Yeah, who is this?" The moment he heard the reply, his expression changed instantly. Karen noticed the way his spine straightened, the way his face drained of color. He gave a stiff nod, his voice suddenly professional. "Yes, ma'am." "No, ma'am." "Understood." Karen frowned. "What's wrong?" The officer slowly lowered the phone and stared at Ava like he had made a terrible mistake. "Your mom isn't just in the FBI," he muttered. "She's the director. The director of the FBI." Karen's smirk vanished. "Wait, that's not possible." The officer turned back to Ava, suddenly looking deeply uncomfortable. "You're free to go. We apologize for the misunderstanding." Karen's eyes widened. "Misunderstanding? You were about to arrest her. What about my complaint?" The officer barely looked at her. "Ma'am, I suggest you go home." But Karen wasn't done yet. "I want to file charges. This is an illegal business." She still broke the law. The officer sighed and handed the phone to Karen. "Say that to her mother." Karen hesitated, then took the phone. Hello, I need to. Who the hell do you think you are? Karen flinched at the voice on the other end. Lisa Johnson's tone was deadly calm, controlled, but packed with barely restrained fury. Karen opened her mouth, but Lisa continued. You called the police on my daughter for selling lemonade? Lisa's voice darkened. You had armed officers threaten to take her away? Over what? A permit. Karen tried to compose herself. Well, the law is the law, and I. Save it, Lisa snapped. Here's what's going to happen. You are going to leave before I personally open an investigation into every aspect of your life. You understand me? Karen's confidence cracked. That's intimidation. Lisa's voice turned ice cold. You called the cops on a child. You wanted to use the law against her. Now the law is looking at you. You think you can handle that? Karen was speechless. Lisa didn't wait for a response. See you in court, Mrs. Whitmore. Click. The call ended. Karen was shaking. She turned to the officers. She can't do that. Can she? The officers didn't respond. They just walked away. The crowd was staring. Ava smiled. Karen clenched her fists. This isn't over. She stormed off, but she had no idea that things were just beginning. Karen Whitmore sat stiffly in the courthouse waiting room, tapping her manicured nails against the armrest of her chair. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. She had expected Ava's mother to back down, or at least to settle outside of court. But now, here she was, summoned to face legal action from the most powerful law enforcement official in the country. Karen glanced at the courtroom doors. The room beyond them was packed. Reporters, neighbors, even members of the FBI. Everyone wanted to witness this trial. Her lawyer, a tired-looking man in a cheap suit, shuffled his papers beside her. Mrs. Whitmore, we should consider negotiating. Karen scoffed. Negotiate? With them? I did nothing wrong. The lawyer sighed. You called the police on a child for selling lemonade. The prosecution has video evidence, witness testimonies, and now a federal civil rights lawsuit against you. You don't have much ground to stand on. Karen's jaw clenched. That little girl isn't special. If I called the police on any other kid, no one would care. Her lawyer flinched. You may want to avoid saying things like that. The prosecution is arguing racial discrimination. Karen rolled her eyes. Ridiculous. I treat everyone equally. But the truth was, she never thought she'd end up in this position. People like her didn't get taken to court. They made complaints. They got their way. Before she could say anything else, the doors to the courtroom swung open. All rise, the bailiff called. Karen stood, smoothing out her blouse, until she saw who was walking in. Lisa Johnson, dressed in an immaculate black suit. The director of the FBI walked into the room with a confidence that made Karen's stomach twist. She wasn't just here as a mother. She was here as a woman who had spent her life bringing people like Karen to justice. Lisa took her seat at the prosecution's table, her expression unreadable. But when she met Karen's gaze, her cold, knowing smirk sent a wave of panic through Karen's chest. The judge entered and took his seat. Court is now in session. Karen swallowed hard. This wasn't going to be easy. The trial began, and it didn't take long for things to spiral out of Karen's control. The prosecution wasted no time in presenting damning evidence. Video footage from a neighbor's doorbell camera played on the large courtroom screen. Karen's voice echoed through the room. I need officers immediately. There's an unlicensed vendor in front of my house. Yes, the black girl. No adult supervision. It looks suspicious. Murmurs filled the courtroom. Lisa's lawyer stood. Mrs. Whitmore, do you acknowledge this is your voice? Karen's lips tightened. Ah, yes. But I was just reporting what I saw. The lawyer raised an eyebrow. You saw a child selling lemonade in broad daylight, surrounded by neighbors, and you assumed she was committing a crime? Karen crossed her arms. I was following the law. Lisa leaned forward, finally speaking. So tell me, Mrs. Whitmore, how many white children have you called the police on for selling lemonade? The courtroom fell silent. Karen froze. Lisa waited. Karen opened her mouth, then shut it. The truth was painfully obvious. Lisa nodded, satisfied. No further questions. Karen's lawyer tried to salvage the case, arguing that she had acted out of concern for safety. But the jury wasn't buying it. Then, as if things couldn't get worse, the FBI revealed a deeper investigation into Karen's past. Lisa's lawyer stood again. Your Honor, we have uncovered a disturbing pattern of behavior from Mrs. Whitmore. A file was placed on the judge's bench. The judge flipped through it, frowning deeply. Lisa's lawyer turned to the jury. This is not the first time she has used law enforcement to target black individuals for minor or non-existent offenses. In the past 5 years, she has made at least 4 complaints against black families in her neighborhood for playing music too loudly, for standing on a public sidewalk, for looking suspicious in a parking lot. Each time, the police were called. Each time, nothing was wrong. Gasps rippled through the room. Karen felt dizzy. Lisa tilted her head. You don't treat everyone equally, do you, Mrs. Whitmore? Karen's hands trembled in her lap. She had walked into this trial thinking she was the victim. But now, it was clear to everyone in the room. Karen Whitmore was the problem. Karen's breath came in short, panicked bursts. The weight of the courtroom's judgment pressed against her, suffocating. Just minutes ago, she had sat with smug confidence, believing she could talk her way out of this. Now, the entire room was staring at her like she was the criminal. She turned to her lawyer, silently pleading for help, but he wouldn't even meet her eyes. He knew, just as well as she did, that this case was already lost. Lisa Johnson remained composed, her expression unreadable. But there was something in her eyes, a quiet, knowing certainty that sent chills down Karen's spine. Lisa had seen people like Karen before, and she had brought them down before, too. Karen swallowed hard as the judge tapped his gavel. We'll take a short recess before we move forward with closing statements. The moment the judge left, Karen exploded. She spun on her lawyer. This is a witch hunt. Do something. Her lawyer sighed, rubbing his temples. Mrs. Whitmore, you need to consider cutting a deal before this gets worse. Karen's mouth fell open. A deal? For what? I didn't do anything wrong. A voice cut through the tension. You still don't get it, do you? Karen turned sharply. Lisa was standing now, arms crossed, looking at her with something that wasn't anger, but wasn't pity, either. You thought you could use the law as a weapon, Lisa continued, her voice calm but sharp as a knife. You've done it before, haven't you? Karen's stomach twisted. You called the police on innocent people, thinking there'd be no consequences. You assumed you'd always be on the winning side of the system. Lisa tilted her head slightly. But what happens when that system finally turns its gaze back on you? Karen felt a cold sweat forming on her back. You should have just apologized, Lisa said simply. Then she walked away. Karen's hands clenched into fists. She wouldn't apologize. She wouldn't lose. Would she? The recess ended quickly. The judge returned, and so did the jury. Karen couldn't stop fidgeting as the courtroom settled into silence. The judge cleared his throat. Members of the jury, have you reached a verdict? A man in the front row, the jury foreman, stood up. He held a folded piece of paper in his hands. Yes, Your Honor. Karen's chest tightened. The paper was passed to the judge. He read it, his expression blank, before handing it back. He nodded to the foreman. Please deliver your verdict. The man turned toward Karen, and in that moment, she realized that she had lost everything. We, the jury, find the defendant, Karen Whitmore, guilty of filing a false police report, racial discrimination, and harassment. The courtroom erupted. Some gasped. Some whispered. The reporters in the back scribbled notes furiously. Karen's vision blurred. No, no. Her entire body froze as the judge spoke again. Mrs. Whitmore, due to the severity of this case and your history of repeated incidents, I am sentencing you to 6 months in county jail, followed by a $50,000 fine and mandatory community service. Karen gasped aloud. Jail. Her lawyer's head sank into his hands. But Lisa? Lisa just nodded once, satisfied. Karen felt like the ground had been ripped out from beneath her. This isn't happening, she whispered. This can't be happening. But it was. The bailiff approached. Mrs. Whitmore, please stand. Karen could barely process what was happening as cold steel clicked around her wrists. She had called the police on a child. And now, the police were taking her away instead. As she was led out of the courtroom, past the crowd of stunned onlookers, she locked eyes with Lisa one last time. Lisa's expression remained unreadable, but then, she smirked. Karen Whitmore was officially done. The cold steel of the handcuffs bit into Karen Whitmore's wrists as the bailiff led her out of the courtroom. The weight of the moment crashed down on her all at once. She wasn't walking out of here as a victor. She wasn't walking out at all. The whispers in the courtroom were deafening. This is unbelievable. She really thought she could get away with it. Finally, someone like her faces consequences. Karen's legs felt unsteady, her breath coming in sharp gasps. Jail. Fines. Community service. Her entire life was about to be ripped apart. She turned her head sharply, eyes locking onto Lisa Johnson one last time. The FBI director sat calmly, arms folded, watching her with a level gaze. Not cruel, not gloating, just knowing, as if she had seen this happen 100 times before. And then, to Karen's absolute horror, Lisa smirked. Something in Karen snapped. "This is wrong," she shrieked, her voice cracking. "This is a setup. A political move. I was just following the law. This is my country." The bailiff tightened his grip on her arm, pulling her forward, but Karen wasn't done. She twisted violently in his grasp, eyes blazing. "I am the victim." Lisa raised an eyebrow. "You're really still playing that card?" Karen's mouth opened, but no words came out. Because deep down, she knew. This wasn't a setup. This wasn't political. This was justice. And for the first time in her life, she was on the other side of it. The holding cell smelled of sweat and disinfectant. Karen sat on the hard metal bench, arms wrapped around herself, her designer clothes now just as wrinkled and useless as her reputation. She had spent years thinking she was untouchable, calling the police on black families, complaining about suspicious people in her neighborhood, using the system to enforce her version of order. But the real system had caught up to her. She glared at the bars in front of her. "This isn't happening," she muttered. "This isn't happening." But it was. The door creaked open, and a guard stepped inside. "You have a visitor." Karen's heart leapt. Her husband? A friend? Someone here to get her out? The guard stepped aside, and Karen's stomach dropped. Lisa Johnson stood on the other side of the bars, arms crossed, watching her. Karen's throat went dry. Lisa tilted her head. "How's the lemonade in here?" Karen's jaw clenched. "Go to hell." Lisa just smiled, shaking her head. Karen, you really thought this would never catch up to you, didn't you?" Karen's hands curled into fists. "This is your fault." Lisa shrugged. "No, Karen, this is your fault." Karen had no response. Because once again, Lisa was right. "You could have just apologized," Lisa continued, her voice calm but deadly sharp. "You could have admitted you were wrong. But you couldn't do it. You dug yourself deeper. And now," Lisa gestured around the cell, "this is where you ended up." Karen's breathing quickened. "I'll appeal. I'll get a new lawyer. You won't," Lisa cut in smoothly. "You don't have the power anymore, Karen." She let those words sink in. And Karen finally understood. For the first time in her life, she wasn't the one in control. Lisa turned to leave, pausing at the door. "Oh, and Karen?" Karen looked up, eyes burning with anger and humiliation. Lisa smirked. "Enjoy community service." And with that, she walked away. The door slammed shut, and Karen Whitmore sat alone in her cell, her privilege shattered, her power gone, and her legacy reduced to a lesson on what happens when the system finally fights back. The orange jumpsuit felt stiff and foreign against Karen Whitmore's skin. The once proud woman who had strutted through her neighborhood, calling the police on black families for simply existing, now stood in a line of other inmates, waiting for orders like everyone else. She gritted her teeth as the guard barked at them. "Community service assignments are posted. You'll be working in public sanitation, cleaning city streets. No exceptions." Karen blanched. Cleaning the streets? She had imagined her sentence would be something dignified. Maybe office work, filing paperwork, something fitting for a woman of her status. But Lisa Johnson had made sure she got exactly what she deserved. "Move it," the guard shouted. Karen shuffled forward, shoulders stiff. As she was handed a pair of gloves and a trash picker, she heard snickers from behind. "Hey, isn't that the lady who called the cops on a kid for selling lemonade?" Karen's jaw clenched. She turned slightly and saw a group of city workers whispering and smirking at her. "Yeah, that's her," one of them said. Bet she never thought she'd be the one on the other side of the system. Karen's face burned. She wanted to snap back. She wanted to tell them that this was all a mistake, that she wasn't like the criminals she was surrounded by. But she couldn't, because they weren't the ones in an orange jumpsuit. She was. The sun was merciless as Karen dragged a garbage bag behind her, the smell of rotting food and cigarette butts making her gag. People walked by, some glancing at her with mild curiosity, others recognizing her. One woman, a black mother with 2 kids, paused when she saw Karen hunched over, picking up litter. Karen looked away, embarrassed. The mother tilted her head. "Funny, I remember you from the news." Karen stiffened. "You didn't like seeing black kids in your neighborhood. Now look at you." The woman continued, shaking her head. Cleaning up after them. Karen's face went pale. The mother smirked, then walked away, leaving Karen fuming and humiliated. Hours later, drenched in sweat and frustration, Karen was assigned to clean up a small community park. She dragged herself toward the sidewalk, barely registering where she was, until she saw it. A lemonade stand. Karen froze in place. It wasn't just any lemonade stand. It was Ava's. The little girl was back in front of her house, her bright yellow sign flapping in the breeze. But this time, people were lining up, neighbors, reporters, community members, all smiling and chatting as they waited to buy a cup. Karen's stomach twisted into knots. Ava looked up, and their eyes met. For a moment, Karen expected to see mockery, triumph, some kind of satisfaction on the girl's face. But instead, Ava just looked at her with quiet curiosity. Then, with a small smile, she turned away, handing a customer their drink. She didn't need revenge. Karen had already lost. And standing there, covered in dirt and sweat, watching the same little girl she had tried to tear down rise higher than ever, Karen finally understood. She had done this to herself. And there was no one left to blame. Karen couldn't move. The sight of Ava, smiling and selling lemonade like nothing had ever happened, twisted something deep inside her. For the first time in her life, Karen felt small. She had been so certain that she was right, that she was just following the rules, that she was protecting the neighborhood from people like them. But now, standing on the side of the road in an orange jumpsuit, sweating under the judgmental gazes of passers-by, she realized the truth. She hadn't been keeping order. She had been keeping people in their place. And now, she was the one at the bottom. The guard nudged her forward. "Keep moving, Whitmore." Karen forced herself to look away from the lemonade stand, gripping the trash picker so tightly her knuckles turned white. She wanted to disappear, to go back to the way things were before, when she could call the police and they would listen, when her word meant something. But there was no going back. She bent down and picked up a crumpled soda can from the sidewalk, swallowing the lump of bitterness in her throat. Then, she heard a voice. "Would you like a cup of lemonade?" Karen froze mid-motion. Slowly, she turned, and there was Ava, standing just a few feet away, holding out a plastic cup filled with ice-cold lemonade. Karen's mouth went dry. The little girl she had tried to destroy was now offering her kindness. For a moment, Karen wanted to scoff, to refuse, to walk away, but she saw the way the crowd was watching. Some looked amused. Some looked furious. Some just looked curious. And worst of all, Lisa Johnson was there, too. The director of the FBI stood near the lemonade stand, arms crossed, watching everything unfold. Karen's throat tightened. This was a test. She could feel it. "Swallow your pride, Karen." She hesitated. Then, with a stiff nod, she took the lemonade. "Thank you," she muttered. Ava simply smiled. "You're welcome." Karen took a sip. It was the sourest thing she had ever tasted. And yet, for the first time, she didn't complain. Because maybe, just maybe, this was what accountability tasted like. The lemonade was ice cold, the condensation dripping onto Karen's trembling fingers as she held the cup. It should have been refreshing under the relentless summer sun, but to her, it tasted bitter, like humiliation, like the consequences she never thought she would face. She forced herself to swallow. Across from her, Ava just smiled, completely unfazed by the weight of the moment. She wasn't smug. She wasn't cruel. She had already won, and she didn't even have to say it. Karen's hand clenched around the plastic cup. She hated this. Not the lemonade, not the heat, but the way it felt to be powerless. Her whole life, she had been the one in control, the one making the calls, setting the rules. People had listened to her complaints, obeyed her demands. Now, she was the one being watched. Lisa Johnson stood a few feet away, arms crossed, gaze unreadable. Karen didn't know what was worse, the quiet satisfaction in Lisa's eyes or the complete lack of sympathy. This wasn't a woman who felt sorry for her. This was a woman who had seen justice play out exactly as it should. Karen lowered the lemonade. Her fingers twitched. She wanted to say something, anything, to take back control of the situation. Instead, Ava spoke first. "You know," the little girl said, tilting her head, "I don't even think you like lemonade." Karen blinked. "What?" Ava giggled. "You're making a face like it's the worst thing you've ever tasted." Someone in the crowd chuckled. Karen felt her face burn. Ava's innocence, her grace, made this whole thing so much worse. Because the old Karen would have expected the little girl to hate her. She would have expected glares, whispered insults, someone spitting in her drink. But instead, Ava had invited her over like nothing had happened. Like she was just another customer. Like Karen wasn't even important enough to hate. Karen's grip tightened on the cup. Her voice came out quiet. "Why did you offer me this?" Ava shrugged. "You looked thirsty." The words hit Karen harder than she expected. For a moment, she had nothing to say. She had spent so much time justifying what she had done, convincing herself that she had been right, that calling the police had been necessary. But standing here, face to face with the little girl she had tried to ruin, she suddenly didn't have the energy to lie to herself anymore. Her throat tightened. I shouldn't have called the police on you." A hush fell over the small crowd. Even Lisa raised an eyebrow, surprised at the sudden admission. Ava, though, just smiled again, like she had been expecting it all along. "I know," she said simply. Karen swallowed hard. The words tasted like poison, but she forced them out. "And I shouldn't have treated you like you didn't belong here." Another truth. Another painful, bitter pill to swallow. For a moment, there was silence. Then, Ava beamed. "That's okay," she said. "People change." Karen stared at her. Did they? She didn't know if she believed that yet. But what she did know was this. For the first time in her life, she had lost. And maybe, just maybe, that was exactly what she had needed. Karen took another slow sip of the lemonade. This time, it didn't taste quite so sour. Karen Whitmore still had 6 months left in her sentence. She still had fines to pay, community service to complete. She still had to live with the fact that the world had seen her for exactly who she was. And yet, somehow, that moment at the lemonade stand stayed with her more than any of it. Not the trial, not the handcuffs, not even Lisa's smirk, but a 9-year-old girl who had looked at her, smiled, and given her a second chance, even when she didn't deserve it. Maybe she never would deserve it. But as Karen scrubbed graffiti off a wall later that day, sweat dripping down her back, she thought about those 3 words Ava had said. People change. Karen didn't know if she was changing, but for the first time, she thought that maybe, just maybe, she should try.